Vice presidential debates rarely shape our national conversation, but 30 years ago today, Democratic candidate Lloyd Bentsen gave viewers a moment to remember with his dig at Republican candidate Dan Quayle.
I have far more experience than many others that sought the office of vice president of this country. I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency. I will be prepared to deal with the people in the Bush administration if that unfortunate event would ever occur.
Senator Bentsen.
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy. To be done in a situation like that. In a situation like that,
you're only taking time
is to call in the joint.
Your own candidate.
That was really uncalled for, Senator.
You're the one that was making the comparison, Senator, and I'm one who knew him well. And frankly, I think you're so far apart in the objectives you choose for your country that I did not think the comparison was well taken.
Boy, politicians, comedians alike have all lampooned Bentsen's burn in the years since. And though Quayle did win the vice presidency alongside George H.W. Bush, that very moment, it had a lasting effect on his political ambitions. Noah Bierman reflected on that moment prior to the 2016 vice presidential debate. He's a White House reporter for the Los Angeles Times, and he joins me now from Washington. So, Noah, you spoke to some of the major players that actually helped prepare Bentsen. Take us through exactly how that moment in the VP debate developed.
Well, I think the most interesting thing is how it almost didn't happen. Senator Bentsen didn't even want to debate Quayle. He felt like Quayle was more of the television generation. He was an older, didn't feel comfortable in that kind of a setting. So he had to be persuaded by his aides to even do the debate. They made a token effort to get out of the debate, but they did it. And then it was up to the preparation. You know, nowadays there's so much opposition media, opposition research and people tracking candidates with small cell phone cameras, and nothing a candidate does is at all goes unnoticed by the public. But in those days, it required quite a bit more research ahead of a situation like this, a debate. So Dennis Eckert, who was a congressman from Ohio, was tasked to play Dan Quayle in the debate as his stand-in, and he took it upon himself to do all kinds of research. And one of the things he noticed was an increasing comparison that Quayle, who was getting questions about his youth and inexperience, was getting on the trail, and that he was increasingly comparing himself with Kennedy because they had had a similar amount of time in Congress and they were of a similar age. And he knew that this would be something that the contrast of somebody like Bentsen, who was very experienced and known as sort of a statesman, could really use to his advantage. But the trick was to get Bentsen to play along, because Bentsen was not, especially by the context of today's politics, not a puncher, you know. And so they had to, in debate preparations, really work to persuade him and really get his goat enough to get him to say, okay, I'm going to level the punch here.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned just how they had to convince Bentsen to actually do this debate. When that moment happened, how was it possible that Bentsen was just so incredulous at the idea that Quayle could compare himself to JFK?
Well, I think there was a lot of preparation. I think that during the preparation, at first, what I'm told by people who were involved was that Bentsen was sort of reticent. He was willing to let the moment pass, but he was seething inside. And I think what they said to him was, take that energy, take that anger, and bring it to the debate floor. And the reason he was seething was because, you know, here's an icon of the Democratic Party who had been assassinated. And this is somebody who Bentsen had worked directly with and knew, as he says in the famous soundbite. And to him, this was just offensive. A young Republican who had he totally disagreed with and who had not had that same kind of experience. And so they wanted Bentsen to take it as personally as possible and then really make sure that the public knew how upset he was with it to make that come across in the debate.
Noah, how do you think that very moment affected the careers of Dan Quayle and Lloyd Bentsen?
Well, of course, what happened was Dan Quayle's ticket won, and he was the vice president for George Bush. The Democrats tried very hard to use that against George Bush. They immediately cut ads, and this was George H.W. Bush, and it really made the campaign a large part of it about him leaving Dan Quayle as a heartbeat away from the presidency. It didn't work. Dan Quayle became the vice president. But it did dim the seriousness with which people took Quayle throughout his political career, and he was not able to progress like he wanted to. He wanted to become president, and people just didn't take him seriously after that. Lloyd Bentsen went back to the Senate, and I don't know that this was his last hurrah, was running for vice president, that he wasn't going to be elevated beyond that.
Just so fascinating how one moment can transform or build or tear down a person's political career. Noah Bierman, I want to thank you so much for joining us and breaking that very historic moment down for us.
Thanks for having me.